Hi, my name is Tim Maywald. I've been a tree steward since 2011. I started out with the Arlington Alexandria Tree Stewards, and then after a couple of years moved down to the Charlottesville area and joined the Charlottesville area Tree Stewards. Both in Arlington and here, I've been involved in training for several years, and I've either sat in on or delivered pruning training a number of those years, and I do a lot of pruning with tree stewards in public areas in Charlottesville City and the county and other areas of our jurisdiction. And it's likely that not all of you are going to want to be pruners. I mean, some people like to prune, some people don't care that much for it, but we'd like to make sure that you all know the basic principles of it so that you can share information about that skill if you're doing event tables or with your neighbors or friends or family. So let's get started. We're going to talk about pruning landscape trees, and we're going to focus on young ones. And the reason we're looking at young ones is, well, there are a number of reasons, and I'll go through them with you. But it's great to get trees structural problems which are fixable by pruning, taken care of when the tree is young. So that's what our main target is. Most of the material here is, I have to give credit to Professor Ed Gilman at the University of Florida. You can see his textbook here on the screen. This is it. It's pretty hefty. So there's a lot to pruning. He has a 50 plus series of short 15 to 20 minute videos. And here you'll see I've identified maybe 10 of them. So you don't have to watch the whole series, but if you want to learn more in-depth information about pruning, these are great modules to look at. In this session, we're going to cover the basic pruning concepts, where, when, and what to prune, how a tree works, so that you can minimize the impact on a tree when you're making pruning cuts, because you're deliberately wounding the tree when you make a cut. We'll talk about the types of cuts, and we'll talk about tools, tool maintenance, and safety. And we'll talk about safety last, not because it's least important, but because we want you to remember it. We're out there working with sharp tools, and you need to be careful. So these are our target trees. These two are like parking lot trees, the kind that you'd find around parking lots in public spaces. These trees are ones that are along a trail or a roadway, and they're the ones that we're usually asked to assist with by local government. And you probably have trees in your yard, so you can use these techniques on your own trees. We work mostly with hand tools, a little bit of power tools, and we'll talk about that. We work mainly from the ground. We don't do much climbing. We don't use ladders. We're not equipped or knowledgeable about using climbing gear as you would with mature trees. Now, sometimes if we need to get a little bit of extra height to reach the top of a tree, we'll work out of the bed of a pickup truck, something like that. Pretty safe platform, stable. And of course, young trees, best time to shape them in order to avoid structural problems or failures as they get large. All of the landscape trees around here are originally forest trees. And you can see what the structure is for forest trees, and they all look pretty much like telephone poles. That's because forest trees self-prune. They drop their lower branches. Once their upper branches get into the canopy, they're getting full sun, and they're able to very effectively perform photosynthesis, whereas the lower branches below the canopy aren't getting enough sun. So the tree stops giving water and nutrients to those lower branches. They eventually die and fall off. And you can see it pretty clearly on this light trunked tree right here. See the dark spots? Those were all branches, and they've all fallen off. There's a stub left of one of them over here. Eventually it'll fall off. So they have lower branches when they're smaller, as you can see on these beeches here, but they drop them. So nobody has to go into the forest and prune trees. They prune themselves. Let's take a look at this white oak in the forest. light bark. I picked a white oak because they're easy to spot. And also there are no trees in front of it here, so we've got a pretty good view of it. And what you see is this kind of telephone pole type effect. You don't have any lateral branching till you're up here around halfway up, and you have relatively few lateral branches, and you have a narrow crown. And that's simply because there's a lot of other trees around, so they have to grow that way. And trees have been growing this way in the forest for millennia. This is how they've learned to grow in order to best survive in that kind of ecosystem. So let's look at what the same tree, a white oak, looks like when it's out in the open landscape. And it looks like a different tree, a beautiful tree, but massive lower branches. Your trunk comes up and it's got a big cluster of branches here that are splitting off. The main lead or trunk splits here, and you get codominance. So they look a lot different because they have sun, 360 degrees. They develop a more broad and complex crown. The lateral branches start low and grow very large, and that creates a lot of mechanical stress at the joint where those large branches attach to the trunk. The limbs develop in close proximity to each other. You can get multiple stems or multiple leads forming, and these factors can lead to branch failure. And some of these we can deal with through pruning, but one way or another, they have to be pruned. They don't prune themselves. And we look at young trees because if you can correct these structural defects when it's young and easy to reach, you can avoid problems later. And it's costly pruning mature trees. You have to hire a professional to do it, and they're not inexpensive. Also, young tree wood responds better to pruning than more mature trees with big branches. The young trees have what's called sapwood, which is a softer kind of wood than you have when the heartwood at the center of mature tree branches. You can make smaller cuts because they're smaller branches, which means there's less opportunity for decay to enter the tree. And of course, they're easier to reach. Here's some things we're not going to talk much about. Shrubs or hedge pruning, topiary, pruning mature trees, and pruning fruit trees for production. If you have mature trees on your property and you think they need some work, you might want to hire an arborist. And it's easy to find one. You could just go to whatever your search engine is, Google or whatever, and put in find an arborist, no spaces, all one word. And it'll take you to the International Society of Arboristry, or you can go directly to this URL. And this is what you'll come to. So you can click on find an arborist. And again, this is an international society. So the first thing it'll say to you is, what country are you in? And then you say the US. And it says, what state are you in? And then I think the next question is either what city or county, or maybe it asks for a zip code, but you end up getting a list of all of the certified arborists in your immediate area. Or you may find that someone has referred you to a particular arborist. And if you want to find out more about them, or at least whether they're certified, you can verify their credentials by clicking over here. And we won't be talking about pruning fruit trees for production. That's kind of a specialty skill. But here in the Albemarle County area, you have Albemarle Cider Works, and they do classes on orchard tree pruning that are very, very good practice, very good classes rather. I've taken a couple of them and they know what they're doing. So I will say this briefly about hedges, which is that we prune them backwards. We prune them wide at the top and narrow at the bottom because the lower branches are shaded out. They lose their leaves and they look kind of scraggly. Should be doing it this way. Prune them narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, and that way you're getting sun all around and you don't end up with these holes. We're not going to talk about topiary. We're not going to talk about pruning big mature trees. Heck, I don't think I could climb that tree with all that gear on me. And just a quick note on pruning fruit trees. This is the same branch before and after. So you can see you really go at it. You take a lot of the structure off. And you do that because the cuts that you're making are going to spur growth. And that's what you're trying to do. Um, and the second thing that you're trying to do when you're pruning for production is you want to leave space between the branches, enough space so that when the branches are laden with fruit, they don't collide with each other. They don't come down on top of each other and frustrate the growth of the fruit. So check out Albemarle Cider Works. Let's go over a couple of general things like what is pruning, and it's defined as the selective removal of specific plant parts, and we're usually talking about branches or parts of branches. If we're taking off the whole branch, that's a removal cut. If we're taking off part of the branch, it's called a reduction cut. We're talking about removing adventitious growth, which is defined as growth on a tree that's not going to help the tree. It's growing from somewhere where you normally wouldn't have growth. Suckers and water sprouts, and I'll give you examples, photos of all of these as we go along. And also, we want to look at the surface of the ground to see whether there are any surface root problems. Circling roots and girdling roots are what we're talking about, and we'll look at those in a moment. And of course, your main reason for why we prune is because when you're dealing with landscape trees, they don't prune themselves, so we have to prune them. But we prune overall for the health of the tree. Tree stewards are interested in successful trees, and not just successful, but trees that flourish, that do as well as they can. And pruning can help. We prune for safety. If you have a broken branch in a tree or a dead branch, it's going to come down sooner or later. It's always better for you to decide when it comes down. Aesthetics, you're going to improve the appearance or view by doing some pruning. Clearance can be an issue. Do you have a branch growing somewhere where you'd rather not have it growing? And basically, you're just trying to create good structure for a long, healthy life. And we mainly target deciduous trees. Conifers generally tend to have pretty good shape and don't need to have as much pruning or any compared to deciduous trees. They have good branch structure. They don't go dormant. They're growing all the time. So in dormancy is one of the better times to be pruning your trees, and they don't go dormant. And also, when you take a branch off a conifer, you're taking food away from it. Conifers, unlike deciduous trees, store their excess food in their branches instead of in their roots. And in general, they just don't respond as well to pruning as do deciduous trees. So if we're going to prune one, we're usually going to do it because there's a health issue or a safety issue or perhaps codominant leads. If you're not familiar with the term codominant leads, we're going to go over them in detail because they're potentially a major problem with trees. So you can actually start your pruning right at the time that you purchase your tree by pruning, by picking a tree that doesn't need to have a lot of pruning. And actually, even before you get to the place where you're going to buy your tree, select a tree that's going to fit the space where you want to plant it and picture it when it's mature. So if you have a crepe myrtle, you need to be aware that they grow to 30 feet tall. So although technically it's a small tree, it's not all that small. And, trees are broken up into 3 different size groups, up to 30 feet and then 30 to 60, 60 to 90. You really need to be thinking about what size the tree is going to be at mature stage, because you don't want to have to prune it in order to make it fit. The tree is going to be fighting you for its lifetime. And generally, we're looking for most of our deciduous trees to have a single leader, a single trunk. Now, there are a lot of exceptions to this. There's 2 groups of trees that are multi-trunk naturally, like river birch and crepe myrtle. And also, you have trees which naturally have a spreading broad trunk. And you see that particularly in your understory trees, redbud, dogwood, serviceberry, basswood, and you don't want to try to prune them for a single trunk. So you need to be practicing your tree ID skills and know what tree it is that you're pruning so that you can tell what kind of a structure it naturally wants to have. But by and large, we want to prune most of the trees out there for a single leader, because if you don't, you can run into some potential failure problems when the tree gets big. And we'll go into that in some detail. Generally, you're looking for the tree to have small branches, and that is, you want all the branches on the tree to be less than half the diameter of whatever they're growing from, another branch or from the trunk. If a branch is over half the size of what it's growing from, you have a potential codominance situation, which means at the point where they join each other, you can have a joint failure. And we'll illustrate this for you. And you want your main branches to be spread well apart for good circulation within the tree. And so they don't, as they grow larger and larger, rub against each other and rub off their bark and create openings where decay causing elements can get inside the tree. So I'll show you a tree that you don't want to buy at the nursery. And there it is. That is a pruning nightmare. That's what you want to buy. So we've got pretty good symmetry here. We have branches growing all around. We have a single leader coming up. These other higher branches are not competing with this one to be the main lead, which is good. So that's kind of what you're looking for. Next subject is when to prune. Some people will say the best time to prune is when the saw is sharp, which simply means prune when you can get to it. It's really a matter of when you're available. The other end of that spectrum is, let me show you this. You can get these charts online at this URL from Virginia Tech. And they have a series of charts for deciduous trees, conifers, and shrubs. And they'll tell you by species. The black is not a good time to prune it. White is, that's an okay time to prune, not the best, not the worst time. And the gray ones are, these are the optimal months in which to prune this particular species. So again, you need to be able to identify what the tree species is, and then you can look it up. And in general, you can do light pruning on a tree at any time of year if you're not taking very much off, under 15%. And ideally, at any given time, even if it's the best time of year to prune, you don't want to take off more than, say, 25 to 35% of the branch structure at a time. If you have a tree that needs a lot of pruning, spread it out over 2 or 3 years. Ideally, you don't want to prune when it's really cold out because it undermines the tree's capability to form the kind of reaction that it takes to fend off entry of decay when you make a pruning cut. For flowering trees, wait until they finish flowering before you prune them if you want to enjoy the full flowering process. And don't prune trees when they're stressed, like during drought, or if you've had some construction take place at your home and you've had to cut some of the roots. The tree's going to need some time to recover from that. Don't add to the trauma by pruning at that time. In tree stewards, we do a lot of our pruning in the winter. Our deciduous trees are the target and they're dormant. So you're less likely to spur adventitious growth, suckers, sappers by pruning. If you prune during the growing season, you're very likely to get suckers growing at the point where you've made your cut. And of course, in the winter, it's easier to see the branch structure because the leaves are gone on most of the deciduous trees. So you get to see what they look like. It's easier to tell whether you need to do any evening up on the branch structure. And of course, your decay causing entities, bacteria, fungi, viruses, and so on, are less active in the winter. So that's when we usually do our stuff. January, February, March, then we kind of lay off for the spring.